So I realized I didn't do much to introduce myself last week. Just to give you a quick introduction, my name is Max Krasnow. I have a PhD in evolutionary and developmental psychology, which I got at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And I've been working at Harvard for the past 10 years. I've been teaching evolutionary psychology pretty much that whole time. I also teach courses in statistics, educational psychology, psychometrics, and a few other topics. Today, we are going to be setting a basis for how to think about what evolutionary psychology applies to and how we should start to think about the mechanisms that would result from a force like natural selection. So far, we've been seeing how understanding natural selection gives us the power to predict how a population of replicators will change over time in terms of their frequency. But what does that allow us to predict exactly? If we had a perfect picture of all the forces of natural selection that shaped human nature in the past, would we then have a perfect picture of every detail of human nature? In other words, does natural selection explain everything? To answer this question, it helps to start simple and consider the ways of understanding that we use to intuitively understand objects in the world. Take this pile of rocks, for example. If I asked you to explain why they're smooth and shiny, what would you say? And if anybody has an intuition of how you would explain why the rocks are shiny, and this is not a hard question, just say whatever comes to mind, go ahead and chat it. Well, in previous classes, students mentioned things like maybe these stones had been in a river and that the force of the running water over long periods of time smoothed out the edges of the stone to give them this kind of shape and appearance. That is, the understanding or the why that they applied was something like a historical process of explanation, steps that happened in the past. Now consider this wrench. If I asked you to explain why it was smooth and shiny, now what would you say? Would you say anything different? And now that you've seen an example of kind of the simpleness, what would you say? Why is the wrench smooth and shiny?
I think the wrench is smooth because that was.
Oh, unfortunately, you got muted right as you were finishing that sentence.
So the wrenches has the smooth surface because that was designed to be like this. That might be useful for people to use it. That's smooth, so you won't get hurt by it.
That's a great intuition, and that's one of the most common explanations. Exactly. In previous classes, students said exactly that it's smooth and shiny because, well, A, it's made out of steel or some metal like that. And if you wanted to say, like, why is it made out of steel? They would say because the tool maker used it because it's strong enough for the wrench should work, and that for a person to grab it, it shouldn't have any rough edges, that it's smooth so that it doesn't hurt your hand when you use it. And so if you compare the two explanations, we had the same features in the rock, the stones, they're strong, they're shiny and smooth, and the wrench, strong, shiny, smooth, but we gave different kinds of explanations. One was a historical process, and one was about like an intention or a design. So from this example, we can see that there's at least two different kinds of explanation. And is that it? Or do we have even more kinds? But before we get to thinking about all of the different layers of explanation that we could use, let's see if different kinds of understanding have different abilities, different utility, different uses. So here's another question. This is a picture of an object, and I've covered up part of it. And my guess is most of you won't be able to identify what that object is. You can see that it's made out of metal, and you can see most of its shape, except for the part that I've covered up. Does anybody have a guess at what it is? Or kind of, if you've seen one before, which I really very much doubt, hold that to yourself. But if anyone just looking at that feels like you have a good idea of what it is, go ahead and share it. It's hard, right? Knowing only these things, that it's metal and shaped like that, some of its physical properties, can you predict what the rest of the shape is, the part that I've covered up? Like, would you guess that it looked like that, or that it looked more like that? If you're like my classes in the past, you'd be pretty evenly split. And most people would just be kind of unsure what the right answer was. And that would probably be even more true if my Photoshop skills were better. Now let me give you a design explanation for the tool and see if that helps your intuitions. What this actually is an olive pitter. And those loops in the full image are what a person using it would do. They would put their fingers through those loops, and an olive would get put in that little cage, and then that straight segment would get plunged through the olive to push the pit out on the left-hand side. And you probably all have the lecture notes, and so you've seen what the image looks like when it's uncovered. But before you had that explanation, you probably didn't really have an intuition of why it should have that shape as opposed to the one that looked like it could turn around. But once you see that people's fingers go in there and what you need to do is push the shaft down, your object mechanics and your intuitions probably start to see that for a human's thumb to go into something that could be used to push, that bottom shape would be a lot better for that than the top shape. And so the idea that I'm trying to show you is that understanding function or understanding design, that can help give us intuitions about features that an object should have. And that's kind of interesting. It turns out there's many types of why questions and many types of why answers. And not all of these Ys are the same or of the same use. If I asked you why the sky was blue, you would probably find an answer about the physical properties, like the wavelengths of light that get reflected best off water, the waves of light that transmit best through our atmosphere, physical things. You would find probably those to be the most logical explanations, the ones that leap most to mind, and the ones that satisfy you. But if I asked you why the Hindenburg burned, you probably wouldn't be satisfied with just an explanation of the fact that it was painted with a flammable material and filled with a flammable gas. If you're too young to have any cultural touchstone for what the Hindenburg was a giant blimp, like the biggest blimp that had ever been made at that point. And it was filled with hydrogen, because hydrogen is a very light gas, and that's what enabled it to, float. And to make it airtight and waterproof, the creators actually painted the outside with a combination of metals that contained a lot of iron particles that itself was flammable. And if you know anything about hydrogen, you know that hydrogen, if exposed to high energy like a flame, is explosive. And so when a spark happened on the Hindenburg, the whole thing burned. And the carriage underneath it, which had hundreds of people in it, crashed to the earth. And the news footage of that incident, and this was, back, I think, more than 70 years ago, the news footage at the time, the famous phrase that was uttered by the newscaster was, "Oh, the humanity," because it was just so tragic. And so if you were someone following up on this and you were saying, why did the Hindenburg burn? You wouldn't be thinking about physical properties necessarily, but you would be thinking about a series of events, right? Well, there was that spark. That spark was the thing that immediately led to the Hindenburg burning. But like we saw on the last page, if I asked you why the olive pitter had that end with a loop on it, you would probably not be satisfied with a series of events or a description of physical properties. You would want to know what that end loop was for. And knowing that it was for putting a thumb in to apply pressure to push out an olive pit, that's the level of explanation that you would find satisfying. These are different kinds of why questions. And as we'll see today, some of them are more helpful than others. Nico Tinbergen was an ethologist working in the early part of the last century, and he gave to science what is likely the most common way of carving these questions up and showing how they relate to each other, particularly when you're describing living organisms. Tinbergen proposed that these questions are fundamentally organized into two dimensions. At an abstract level, these questions either target the sequence of events that led up to something or its history. That's kind of at the long time scale. Or the causal relations that preceded the event in the short term, which you can think of as the functional series of steps that led to that thing happening. And these are obviously organized on this dimension as like sequences versus logical steps, like this is for that, this is designed for that. And at the other dimension, we have a long time scale versus a short time scale. So we can think of both history and function, sequences and causes, at both a long time scale and a short time scale. When we're thinking about that long time scale and that sequence of events, for living organisms, we get the level of why, that level of causal explanation that we call phylogeny. Phylogeny is the evolutionary history of a species. But at the shorter time scale, we get what's called ontogeny. Ontogeny is development of a particular organism across its lifespan. So phylogeny is the sequence of changes to a lineage over genetic time. Ontogeny is the sequence of changes during an individual's lifespan. So long time scale, short time scale, both in terms of a sequence of events. But on that causal or functional level of that dimension, we can think of the difference between ultimate causality and proximate causality. Ultimate causality is, why did those long-term changes happen? And proximate causality is, why did those short-term changes happen? Let me give you some better examples. This question of phylogenetic history can be phrased as, what series of evolutionary events led to that feature being here in the present? This is a question about ancestry and inheritance of traits and genes being inherited from those ancestors. For example, humans have what's called trichromatic color vision. That is, we have in our eyes 3 different types of color sensitive cells that are sensitive to different colors. And the reason, from a phylogenetic perspective, that we have trichromatic color vision would be because we inherited that trait from a common ancestor with basically every other primate that has that same trait. So if you look at this phylogenetic tree, so a phylogenetic tree is an organization of all of the species and how they split off from common ancestors. In blue, we have primates that only have 2 color sensitive cells. They're dichromats. And in red, we have the species of primates that are trichromats, that have 3 different colors of 3 different cells that have sensitivity to different colors. And what that means is that they can see a broader spectrum of colors. So those animals on the red lineage can see a wider variety of colors than the animals on the blue lineage. And you can see that evolutionary history provides some deal of explanation, because except for the Alouetta, basically all of the animals that have trichromatic color vision got it from a common ancestor, and that was the same common ancestor for all of them. The question of ontogeny can be phrased as, what series of developmental events, so development over the lifespan, led an organism to having a trait like that? Life, of course, is a series, a cascade of interactions between your genes and your environment. And this question asks us to identify those experiences, those events in maturation, etc., that are necessary for that trait to appear as it is. And if we stick with the part of the body, we're going to be using this for all of our examples. If we stick to the eyes, we can look at a feature of eyes, which is that some of us, wear glasses. Some of us have poor vision compared to other people and compared to prior generations, in fact. So this is way too small for most of you to see, but let me just walk you through what this graph is. So what this is plotting is the numbers and percentages of the population that end up with myopia. So needing to wear glasses to see things close up. And in the bars, we're looking at proportions of people. So what we're doing is taking different generations. So like if at any point in time you look at young people and old people, you'll see that young people, there's fewer young people who have glasses than old people. But young people today and old people today weren't alive at the same time. And so if you just look at people who are alive at the same time, it's hard to tell what exactly in the past might have led to a situation. And so what this graph is doing is it's aligning all of the generations so that you're looking at them at the same age. So this is kind of like a birth year controlled comparison. And what this is comparing is the number of and proportion of people in a population who need glasses is much higher for people who have been born later. Our generation is going to end up needing more glasses than our parents' and grandparents' generations did. And so there's something about the early environment that we experienced that our parents' and grandparents' generations didn't experience. For example, we spend a lot of time looking at computer screens. We spend a lot of time buried in a cell phone. We have a lot of experience looking at things, focusing close up. And what this would suggest is that something like an early life experience that differs between generations in the past and generations in the present, that's going to be one of the experiences that causes development over the lifespan to go in one direction or another. The question of proximate cause can be phrased as asking, what is the relationship? What is the kind of design of the immediate physical process that led to that trait appearing? So sticking with the eye and thinking about what exactly is that thing and how did it work? Like, why does that early life experience of focusing on things close up end up resulting in myopia? Well, we actually can understand why this happens, because the way that our eyes focus on things that are close is by, and this is a cross section of an eye. To change the shape of that lens, the muscles on the top and bottom of the eye have to contract. And so if you're spending a lot of time focusing close up, those muscles have spent a lot of time in a contracted state. And just like any physical machine, using it a lot leads it to wear down. And so earlier in life, if you have worn out your ciliary muscles, you end up with weaker ciliary muscles, muscles that aren't able to accommodate quite as much. And that reduces your ability to focus at those close focal depths. And so we can understand kind of at the process level what is causing that trait. But that's a different level of explanation than thinking about why do we have that feature in the first place? What about our long-term inherited ancestry caused us to have eyes that do that, as opposed to eyes that did something else? That is, what's the functional logic of us having that trait? Is it an adaptation that solved an ancestral adaptive problem? And if so, what was that problem? Going back to trichromatic color vision, what we can see is that the primates and that lineage of primates where that trait originated, they do a different kind of activity than the other primates. This group in red, the trichromats, they specialized in foraging for fruits and tender leaves. And if you think about the difference between ripe and unripe fruits and leaves that are young and tender as opposed to old and tough, one of the ways that you can discriminate them is on the basis of color. And often it's color in that red area of the spectrum that would give you an advantage in selecting the ripest fruit as opposed to the unripe fruit. And that's exactly the pigment of cell sensitivity that was added to dichromats that was gained in trichromats. So we can explain why it was our lineage that evolved trichromatic color vision as on that ultimate functional level, as because it helps us gather the ripest fruits. And that was a problem that other species didn't need to solve. And so there wasn't selection on them for traits that could solve that problem. At this point, you have the version of the levels of analysis picture that's common in biology. But over in the cognitive sciences, another researcher proposed a different way of organizing this question that will help us get an even better picture of how to think about things. Thinking about computational mechanisms more generally, both biological mechanisms like a neural circuit in a baby's brain, or a mechanical mechanism like an abacus, or an electronic mechanism like a calculator. This scheme allows us to understand all of these mechanisms. Marr proposed that understanding any such mechanism involves understanding it at 3 distinct levels of analysis. We're going to get into exactly what these are, but just to give you names for them, there's the computational level of analysis, the algorithmic level of analysis, and the implementational level of analysis. All right, so what do these mean? The computational level of analysis asks the question, what is the mechanism doing? What's it accomplishing? What's its function? Focusing in on a specific neural mechanism in the brain of a toddler, let's think about how toddlers end up getting a fear of heights. At some point, they'll react to the visual stimulus of like a steep drop-off that they could fall over with an aversion, a fear. And at the computational level, we could say that what that fear is doing is that it's solving a safety problem, right? Falling off a steep ledge would be really dangerous, right? It would potentially damage you or kill you. And natural selection, if there were mutations that resulted in an aversion to falling, those mutations would be preserved by natural selection. And so at this causal computational level, we can think about the reason why that neural mechanism is there and has the features that it does is because they were successful at solving that safety problem. Thinking about the abacus, we can say, well, that abacus is helping, it has features that enable it to support mathematical operations or algebraic, arithmetic functions. You can do adding and subtracting and multiplying and dividing and stuff like that. Interestingly, that's also true of the calculator, right? In terms of their computational design, what their computational function is, we can think of the calculator and the abacus as having the same function. They're the same at the computational level of analysis. Stepping down a level to the algorithmic level, we can ask, what is the mechanism doing in order to solve that computational problem? That is, what's the algorithm or process that it uses? In the case of the fear of heights response, there's a neural circuit whereby the way that it works is that the eyes perceive a stimulus that gets routed to your visual cortex, back of your brain, and your scene perception, depth perception mechanisms generate the signal large depth. That information is routed to parts of your brain that then trigger an aversion response. And so we can understand the algorithm in the baby's brain is taking those inputs, doing that kind of processing, and having those outputs. That's the algorithm. In the case of the abacus, the algorithm involves rules about how the beads get moved around in order to do particular kinds of operations. In the case of the calculator, there's logical operations that are built into its integrated circuit, its silicon chips. You can think about what the programmer programmed in order to allow it to do its mathematic processes. Notice that even though the abacus and the calculator were the same at the computational level of analysis, we can differentiate them. They're different at the algorithmic level of analysis. And we can say that the other way around too, that mechanisms can use different algorithms, but you can have different algorithms that solve the same computational problem. So that's an important one to keep in mind. Finally, stepping down to the implementational level of analysis, this is asking the question, what is the mechanism made of? What are those parts that are moved around in a way that's dictated by the algorithm such that the computational product is produced? In the case of that toddler and that neural mechanism for fear of heights in the toddler, we would say that it's made of neurons and neurotransmitters and hormones, etc. All of those little bits and bobs that make up that system. The abacus is made out of often wooden beads and wooden rods and a wooden frame. The calculator is made out of silicon and copper wiring and lead soldering, etc. A plastic case and plastic buttons. And notice again that two mechanisms that solved the same computational problem can have completely different implementations. And saying it the other way again, two completely different implementations can be identical at the computational level of analysis. They can solve the same computational problem. Just like with Tinbergen's questions, there's no priority among these levels of understanding. A description at every level of analysis is equally valid. But the whole point of this analysis is that to comprehensively understand the mechanism, you need a description at each level. But that doesn't mean that each level has the same utility or the same usefulness. Imagine that in this box, I have a mechanism. And I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I'm just going to describe it for you at a specific level of analysis and see what it allows you to infer, what it allows you to understand. So first, let's talk about its implementation. So this mechanism has a plastic laminated circuit board and it's etched with copper traces. And in that silicon board, there's embedded small components that contain metal pieces separated by ceramic, and others are made of carbon, and still others are made of more silicon. From that point, do you know what it's for? Like, part of the mechanism has that. Do you know what the rest of the mechanism looks like? Or what the rest of the mechanism is doing? Do you know if it's, for example, a smartwatch or a calculator, or maybe a control system in your car or in your dishwasher? It's really hard to know, right? How about other features that the mechanism would have? Like, does it have buttons? Does it have a microphone? Does it have a screen? It's hard to know. Understanding something merely at the implementational level of analysis doesn't give us the kinds of inferences that allow us to predict other features of a mechanism beyond the features that we've already observed. Let's check the algorithmic level. What if I tell you that that circuit board, the way that electricity moves around the circuit board, it's performing logical operations like OR, and AND, and exclusive OR, all of them. And it's using those logical operations on bits of information that have been stored and retrieved and processed and stored and retrieved and processed. How about now? Are you any closer to knowing if it's a smartwatch or a dishwasher or a control system in a car? Still hard to know. Do you know what other parts it has? Do you know if it has a microphone or a screen or a keyboard? It's still hard to know. Now, what if I told you that one of the computational functions that it was designed to solve is to inform a human user about the time of day and what their text messages say? Now you can be pretty sure it's not a circuit in a dishwasher, right? You can be pretty sure it's probably not a control circuit in a car. It's much more likely to be a circuit in a smartwatch, right? And if it's informing a human about what their text messages are, it's much more likely now that you would say that it has a screen, right? Because that would be a useful, functional way of being able to do that function. I think that's interesting, right? It seems like the computational level of analysis gives us particularly useful information about that lets us generate predictions outside the range of what we've observed. It lets us predict other features that a mechanism should have. Because once we understand what something is for, we can think about other things that would let it be able to do that thing better. Let me just take a quick break for questions. Are we on track so far? Does that make sense? Anything that you'd like to ask at this point? Okay, well, keep track of any questions that you do have, and we'll have another pause later on so that questions can get asked. But thinking about what we just saw, now let's consider the kinds of data that are often gathered to understand brain mechanisms. Often what we get are single cell recordings, which gives us the timing of neural firing patterns. You get this when you insert an electrode into the brain such that you can measure the electrical activity of a cell, and you can see over time how many times it's had a discharge. And using functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, we can track how blood loses and gains oxygen as it's flowing around the brain. And based on that, we can infer which parts of the brain are using oxygen to do work, because oxygen is used as part of the ATP cycle to generate energy. With diffusion tensor imaging, we can plot the major wiring patterns of the brain. We can see where the long bundles of axons connect. And these are certainly kinds of data that help us describe the brain at the implementational level of analysis, maybe even starting to get to the algorithmic level of analysis. But none of this is an answer at the computational level of analysis. None of this tells us what anything here is for. What's it doing? Why is it there? And so by not having the computational level of analysis solved, or have even at least attempted to be solved, we don't have a complete picture of what the brain is doing. And we might be missing out on what could be the most helpful level of analysis for generating new predictions. Actually, I think we can get a lot of traction by putting Marr and Tinbergen together, kind of thinking about them as an intersection. And so we can think about the proximate implementation, the proximate algorithm, and so on. And within this space, we can position all of the areas of psychological study and describe what level they answer questions at. And I would say that most of psychological research is here. Most of the time, we're looking at implementations and algorithms at the proximate and ontogenetic level of analysis. So we're looking at how individuals develop, what specific events, what are the mechanisms made of, what are the processes that are happening. For example, neuroscience sits squarely in the proximate implementational level of analysis. They're looking at the sequence of brain activity that happens when a person does or experiences something. And cognitive and social psychology, even cognitive neuroscience, are looking still at that proximate, really fine-grained time level, but more looking at the processes that happen. What information is taken in, what happens to it, how is behavior changed? Developmental psychology is still sticking within this box, and it's looking at that same question, but over developmental time, over ontogenetic time. What are the algorithms that 3-year-olds can use that 2-year-olds can't use? And what are the algorithms that adults can use that teenagers or toddlers can't use? What evolutionary psychology contributes to the greater field of psychology and science in general is to highlight that we need all of these levels described. And classic approaches to psychology have been ignoring what I think are some of the most helpful levels of analysis, if what we want to do is understand the brain and understand human nature. So this is why we need evolutionary psychology. And this is why evolutionary psychology makes an essential contribution to psychological science. If we think about that two-dimensional space that we get when we combine Tinbergen and Marr, and we think about the process of natural selection, what is natural selection selecting for? What we can see is that natural selection operates at that intersection of the ultimate and computational levels of analysis. While every mechanism that actually exists in the real world has to have some implementation, and if it's going to be developing in an organism that starts out as a single cell and develops into an adult form, obviously it's going to have some ontogeny, some kind of developmental process. So every mechanism has these things, and you can understand those things. But natural selection doesn't really have any concern, we could say it that way, or natural selection doesn't differentiate among implementations or different developmental patterns just on the basis of that effect. Unless a mechanism solves an adaptive problem at a computational level of analysis, like doing something like finding food better than an alternative, or avoiding hazards, keeping you safe better than alternatives, or finding mates, partners to reproduce with, better than alternatives. Mechanisms that have these effects, that solve these problems, those would be the things that natural selection selects for. If a mutation caused that effect would enable differential reproduction, and that differential reproduction would lead to the mechanism that solves that problem being maintained over time, and the other mechanisms not. And we can only get that level of prediction when we think about the computational level of analysis. In other words, this is a really powerful source of hypotheses about how mechanisms work, what kinds of algorithms make sense, what kinds of implementations and how they should develop. That is, when you understand the computational level of analysis, you can start to make predictions about algorithms, because some algorithms solve the problem, some algorithms don't. Some algorithms solve the problem better than other algorithms do. And if you can differentiate those algorithms on the basis of how well they solve the computational problem, that gives you the kind of information that you can use to think, what would natural selection do or can be expected to do? In other words, we get constraints on hypotheses at the algorithmic and implementational level of analysis by starting with an explanation at the computational level of analysis. To see this principle in action, let's consider a physical mechanism like this coin counter. You could understand a lot about its implementation, like the algorithm that it uses, what it's made out of. But does that really let you predict other features that the mechanism should have? Like, for example, if you didn't know what size of coin gets routed to which bucket, and you didn't know how the machine maps the size of coin to a particular value that it displays on the screen and keeps stored in a buffer and adds to its internal buffer over time to show you a running count or a running tally of the amount of value that that currency has, you wouldn't be able to predict that by knowing algorithms or physical materials, right? Knowing that those bins are made out of plastic, or knowing that the circuit board does and or doesn't help you make predictions about what those features should be. How does it map size to value, and how does it map value, or how does it map size to bucket? But if you think about computational problems, like you could think about this machine being designed to solve the problem of counting currency, of tallying currency in an American market with American coins, or in a Chinese market with Chinese coins. Once you have that explanation, now you can do a lot of prediction, right? If in the United States, we have pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, half dollars, and dollar coins, then you can predict that those six of those slots should be mapped to those 6 sizes of coin, and that a particular size gets linked to a particular value. And you would be making different predictions about what that mapping would be, both in terms of value, size to value, and size to slot, if instead you knew that this was designed for the Chinese market, because in China you have different coins that have different values, that have different sizes than what corresponds between size and value in the United States. And so understanding things at the computational level is really helpful. But just because you have a computational explanation doesn't mean that you have the correct computational explanation. Some of you might have heard the allegory of the blind men and the elephant, which I think illustrates this point nicely. In this story, a group of blind men stumble upon an elephant, and each of them is able to feel with their hands a different part of it. But because they're blindfolded, they can't see the full picture. And because of that, they each come to a different understanding of what they have. The man who's feeling the tusk thinks that he's found the pointy end of a spear. And the man who's feeling the tail thinks that he's found a strong rope. And the man feeling the elephant's side thinks that he's found a sturdy wall. And if you think what you have is a spear, you could understand why that point would be there, but you would also make more predictions that, like, it should have a long shaft, and there should be a handle that's good for holding, and it should be balanced and good for throwing, or at least balanced and good for poking. It should be light enough for a human to carry, but sharp enough and stable enough that it's not going to break when you use it. If what you thought you had was a rope, you would expect it to be very long, right? Because a little piece of rope doesn't do anything for you. So based on that computational explanation, you would make predictions. But because you got the computation wrong, your predictions would be wrong. In other words, by being blind to what the object is, the men are systematically misinterpreting the evidence that they collect. And I think this is not all that dissimilar to what happens in a science when you're not considering the computational level of analysis, or at least not considering it from the perspective of natural selection. Like in psychology, if you open up an intro psych textbook and you see topics like executive function, association, attention, perception, decision-making, reward learning, we can't really see those as computational problems that that are differing on the basis of what natural selection would do. It's hard to map those to ancestral adaptive problems because they're not constructed to be solutions to ancestral adaptive problems. They're descriptions of the data that you have without considering how a mechanism should be designed to solve an adaptive problem. And so despite the fact that there's textbook after textbook after textbook that has a table of contents that includes all these topics, how confident should we be that we've understood human nature and the mind correctly if we're blinding ourselves to what our mental mechanisms are for? So that, in a nutshell, is why evolutionary psychology is important. Now, as it turns out, taking that ultimate perspective helped scientists understand one of the most complicated and perplexing questions in all of biology over the last century. And it's probably going to be surprising to you what this question is, because it just kind of doesn't even feel like a mystery. But then when you start to think about it, it's like, why? Why do creatures have sex? And by sex, I don't mean like the physical act of intercourse. I mean, why do we make offspring that only have half of our genes? Because lots of creatures don't do that. In fact, our ancestors didn't do that if you go far enough back. The very first life on Earth, including our distant ancestors, reproduced offspring by cloning themselves, by asexual reproduction. They created offspring that are genetically identical to them unless a mutation occurred. And this is actually the reproductive strategy that's used by most species on the planet, including single-celled organisms like bacteria, or many bacteria most of the time, and multicellular organisms like hydras and fungi, mushrooms. And the reason why this is such a successful strategy, that the majority of species on the planet use it, is that it's efficient. For all of the resources and energy that a parent spends to produce an offspring, it's guaranteed that each offspring has 100% of your genes, of that organism's genes, unless that mutation occurs, right? Unless one of them mutates, then slightly less than 100% chance. The implication of this fact for how we should think about the level at which natural selection acts starts with this idea. If you reproduce, then each of the genes in you gets reproduced as an asexual cloner. That is, what's good or bad for one of them is good or bad for the rest of them. And you could think about genes being reproduced, or you could think about individuals being reproduced, because essentially they're the same. It's the same idea. Or saying that another way, what this means is that for an asexual species, the reproductive rate of the gene is the same as the reproductive rate of the organism. And so our model of natural selection for a species like this, we can either think of genes being reproduced, or individuals being reproduced, individuals having individual offspring, or genes producing copies of genes, because those are going to be the same. The numbers are going to be the same. Of course, that's not how we reproduce, and that's not how most animals reproduce. Animals are just one part of the tree of life. We reproduce sexually. Why? Where did that strategy come from? Is there any problem with producing offspring that are genetically identical to you? any problem with creating offspring that are genetically identical to you, that themselves have offspring that are genetically identical to them, and so on and so on and so on over time. This strategy does present a problem because your body, your phenotype, built by your genes, which is so similar to your child's phenotype, built by those same genes, is actually the environment for other organisms. Pathogens and parasites, those organisms that make a living by exploiting their host's body, are successful to the extent that they're well adapted to that body, to that phenotype. Think about all the diseases that we need to get vaccinated for that our pets don't need to get vaccinated for, or the diseases that our pets have to get vaccinated for, but that we don't. Bacteria, viruses, etc., specialize on particular species, and by doing that, they're less well adapted to other species. And if we think about why this happens and how this works, these bacteria and viruses tend to have much, much faster replication rates than the large hosts that they exploit. They have many more generations where natural selection can act to tailor them to their host's body. For every one generation where natural selection could begin to act on the host in response. And if you're an asexual species, those offspring that are genetically identical to you means that all of the natural selection that caused a pathogen to be particularly well adapted to you means it starts not from the same starting line when it gets to your kids. It's already a lot of the way towards being perfectly well adapted to that environment. And then at that next replication of yours, your grandkids are starting off in an even worse place. So simply by being in the world, you're making the world worse off for individuals that are genetically identical to you, because all of the natural selection on your pathogens also allows those pathogens to be better able to exploit those clones of you. If that's the problem, then sex is the solution. When a species reproduces sexually, two parents contribute a portion of their genes for the offspring, and those genes that they pass on are actually a mixture of the contributions of their own parents. The result of this is that sexually reproduced offspring are genetically dissimilar to their parents, making all of that time that a pathogen spent learning how to exploit a parent, they kind of have to start all over to a degree, or at least relatively more, if they start to try to exploit their child. So the solution of sexual reproduction has a benefit, but it entails a cost, right? For all of the effort and energy and material that goes into reproduction, a gene only has a 50% chance of being passed on. And that price is paid to achieve the benefit that offspring produced by sexual reproduction are less vulnerable to a parent's pathogens, meaning that more of them can survive to reproduce themselves. And this trade-off between the lower chance of a gene getting reproduced versus the higher chance of those genes sticking around to reproduce explains which species are sexual reproducers and which are asexual reproducers around the world. The longer a species' generation time, how long it takes on average for them to reproduce, the longer that is compared to the pathogens and parasites they have, the more likely the host is to reproduce sexually. The shorter a species' generation time is compared to their pathogens and parasites, the less likely that species is to reproduce sexually, more likely to be asexual. Of course, there's also environments that are particularly hostile to pathogens and parasites, like in the highly salt concentrated, very cold temperature subglacial seas in the Arctic. There are sharks that live there that can live for hundreds of years, and they also reproduce on occasion by cloning. And the reason why that can work in that environment is that there's very few bacteria and viruses that are able to survive in that kind of environment. So that pressure from pathogens just doesn't exist. So sometime about 1 billion years ago, our distant ancestors went down the path of sexual reproduction. But just because a species sexually reproduces, like this is actually an instance of sexual reproduction between bacteria, does happen on occasion, doesn't mean that it has sexes that are different from each other. In fact, if you look at many species that reproduce sexually, like these bacteria, they don't have distinct sexes at all. And not having distinct sexes actually makes things easy because any other member of your species is a potential partner, as opposed to a species that has distinct sexes, where reproduction is only possible with partners of the opposite sex. And we're talking in a world without modern technology. But clearly, humans and many other creatures do have distinct sexes. So where does that design come from? Once a species starts down the road of sexual reproduction, this opens up a new target for natural selection to act on. How much material and energy is it beneficial to be invested in one offspring to maximize their reproductive fitness compared to what you could get for using that same material and energy to invest in a different offspring? If you reproduce sexually, this question gets more complicated because both parents are sources of investment. And if one parent takes on more, then the other parent could save some energy and material and use that for another offspring of its own, right? Even starting with that very first investment that a parent makes, the contribution of material into the sex cells or the gametes, we're talking about sperm and eggs, those cells that first start to fuse to begin building an embryo, this question shows up. How much should one parent put in to their own gametes? When you have limited resources, it's going to be generally true that as you add more and more investment, there's going to be increasing returns to survivability, right? The more resources you put into that egg, the more likely that egg, embryo, baby is to be able to survive because it has resources it can use. And if it has a temporary period of not being able to get resources, it doesn't starve to death, at the very least. But those same resources could always be split up into a greater number of gametes, and thus a greater number of possible kids. That's the trade-off. You can invest more per gamete and make those offspring more viable, or you can invest less per gamete and create the potential of having many more offspring. Of course, there's an asymmetry here. There's diminishing marginal returns to viability. That's why that curve has a bend. If you think about the difference between a teeny tiny egg that actually might starve and a big enough egg that it's not going to starve, there's differences in the return across that range. But once you get out past that curve, an egg being bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger is no longer solving that problem better. And so that energy and material is essentially wasted. In fact, there's a point in this curve where, depending on where the other partner is, it's either better or worse for you to put energy and material into this offspring. Now imagine a population of sexual reproducers who, just because of mutation, have variance in that trait. Those who make the big gametes, they don't get much benefit from mating with others with big gametes. Their offspring already are past that point of diminishing marginal returns. And so it doesn't even really matter. They don't get a benefit from being choosy between small gamete producers and large gamete producers because they can mate with both of them. But for the small gamete producers, in that situation, their offspring are better off if they mate with the large gamete producer. And if they're mating with the large gamete producer, that means they're higher up on this curve and they can actually invest less so that they can have even more offspring. And that asymmetry causes runaway over time, because as the small gamete producers, the ones who just started out by chance producing small gametes, are under selection to produce smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller gametes, that puts the large gamete producers further down on this curve. And so natural selection acts on them to make their gametes bigger and bigger and bigger until you're back up to that inflection point in the curve. And once that system runs away to the extreme, what you have is a situation where large gamete producers can't even mate with large gamete producers. Small gamete producers can't produce an offspring with other small gamete producers. That is, individuals who have the same morph or the same form of gamete are mutually incompatible. And that is the definition in a species for biology of what the sexes are. That's the situation where you have two sexes. And this is the definition of sex in biology. The sex that invests a lot into big cell contents, that is what a female is, across species. It's not about any other trait. It's just about this trait. The sex that invests a little in very tiny but very many small gametes, that's the sex that's termed male by biologists. It's not any other trait. Now, once you think about the situation, producing a few big gametes where there's a lot at risk if one of those gets wasted versus many, many, many small gametes where if one gets wasted, it's not a big deal. You could think about different selection pressures, right, that are going to be acting on those two different sexes. This is the class of thinking that goes down the road of what's called parental investment theory. And we're going to be coming back to this a little later in the course, but I'm just going to put a pin in it for now. The reason why I'm bringing it up is that once a species is reproducing sexually, that creates many opportunities for genes in the same individual to have different fitness interests than other genes, even in that same individual. So this is a different situation than when we were thinking about cloners, because for cloners, genes and individuals had the exact same interests. So for example, take mitochondrial DNA. These are DNA in the mitochondria of all of your cells. So all of us have mitochondrial DNA. But mitochondrial DNA are passed on only by women, only by mothers. And so while a mother is passing on mitochondrial DNA to both her daughters and her sons, it's only her daughters who could then pass that mitochondrial DNA onto her children, because her son is not going to be passing on that mitochondrial DNA to his children. And so imagine a mutation that could occur on a mitochondrial chromosome. And what that mutation might do is change the sex ratio of children that gets reproduced. Imagine what that mutation did was create a protein that made it difficult for embryos that were male from attaching to the uterus. And so those embryos would get cleared. But any embryo that didn't have a Y chromosome, any female embryo, would be able to stick. Now, that woman would end up having more daughters than if that mutation wasn't there. In other words, that mutation would be under selection, positive selection, because that's what would make it most able to spread because it's in a mitochondrial chromosome. But that's actually obviously not what's in the interest of the genes that are in the nucleus of your cells, because those genes in the nucleus, those can get passed on 50-50 to sons and daughters. And so all of those wasted embryos are wasted embryos from the perspective of a nuclear gene. And so any mutation that would arise in the nuclear chromosomes that had the effect of canceling out the sex ratio bias, that would be selected as long as it happened within the nucleus. And we see evidence that this is played out in many species. That's not the only example of this kind of intragenomic conflict. Think about the Y chromosome. This is basically symmetrical to the inheritance pattern for mitochondrial DNA. Y chromosomes, you know, that little one right there, they're the ones that have that HY antigen. They're only passed on. So they're passed on by fathers, but only end up in sons that can then pass them on. If a mutation happened on the Y chromosome that caused a man, so typically male sperm, 50% of them carry Y, 50% of them carry X, because in meiosis, these chromosomes are getting split up and put into gametes at a 50-50% rate. But imagine a mutation on the Y chromosome that basically killed all the X-bearing sperm. That would mean that every kid that man created would be a son. And that would be maximizing the reproductive rate of that gene on the Y chromosome. And this has actually been observed in species. And when it's been observed, it's been called driving Y, because it's basically driving the proportion of Y in the population higher and higher and higher and higher. But it's basically just a sex ratio bias mutation. Obviously, that's not good for genes on the X chromosome and even genes on other chromosomes because of the wasted embryos and stuff like that, wasted energy. And so when this has been observed, it's also been observed that it's counteracted by genes elsewhere in the chromosome. Another example that's really interesting is the Medea gene. So Medea is an acronym for maternal effect dominant embryonic arrest. Let me just break down what that means. This is a gene that's been observed in some flies and beetles. And what this gene does is, in the mother, it produces a toxin, a poison, that would poison all the children. But when it's in a child, it creates the antidote to the poison. And so imagine a mom who has one copy of the gene, so half of her kids have that gene and half of her kids don't. For the kids that do have the gene, they're going to survive. The kids that don't have the gene won't. And so that fly or that beetle is going to be producing only kids that have that gene. So that Medea gene is going to selfishly spread by basically killing off its competitor. It guarantees that 100% of the mom's offspring have that gene. There's an even more exotic example, which is called a homing endonuclease. This is basically a mutation that's taking advantage of the way that DNA repair happens within a cell. So your cells are constantly copying your DNA because it needs to, make new cells, divide, replace themselves over time, constantly making copies. And every once in a while, there's a copy error. And a given piece of chromosome doesn't get copied correctly. Now, in that situation, what the intracellular mechanisms do, is they basically look at the other chromosome for what you could think of as a backup copy, and they copy that section in on the chromosome that was damaged. Now, if that was just happening randomly, that wouldn't be a situation where natural selection was acting on anything. But you could imagine a gene that what it coded for was basically a bomb that got put on that same spot in the chromosome, but on the other chromosome, knocking out its ability to get read. That would cause a copying error, and then the natural mechanisms of DNA repair that are coded for by other genes would copy that gene within the individual to the other chromosome. And that guarantees that that gene is going to be reproduced 100% of the time. And these have been observed as well. So the reason why I'm bringing up all these examples is to differentiate why we need to think about natural selection acting in a species like human differently than the way that we think about natural selection acting on a species like a bacteria or a hydra or a fungus, something that cloned itself. Because in a sexual reproducer, not every gene is going to have the same fitness interests. This is why we need to take what you can call a gene's eye view. What would improve the reproductive rate of that gene? And to answer that question, you need to know, well, what is the circumstance that causes that gene to be reproduced? Like, where does that gene sit? Is it on this chromosome, that chromosome, this chromosome in a different part of the cell? How does it spread? Does it spread by copying itself? Does it spread by killing its competitor? Does it spread by, what's the method? So for example, if you think about a woman's uterus and you imagine a mutation in the mitochondria of her cells that could code for a sex ratio bias, that's the mutation that would spread, right? But now imagine that that mutation happened on a Y chromosome. That same mutation would not spread, right? Because it would immediately kill out. It would stop the reproduction of that Y chromosome. So that same mutation is only under selection depending on the spot that it happens. It would not be under selection if it happened in a different spot. What these examples show us is that not every gene has the same interests, even if they're in the same individual or even in the same genome. That's why it's important to take a gene's eye view when we consider how natural selection will act. The question is, what would improve the reproductive rate of that gene? And answering that question will require thinking about how that gene is reproduced, where it's located, and how that gene gets inherited. Generally, though, all genes are going to face, to a large degree, an important bottleneck: individual reproduction. If I reproduce, then at least most of my genes have a chance to be passed on through me, right? I'm a male, so I'm not going to be passing on my mitochondrial DNA, so those don't have a chance of being passed on through me. But if those mutations interfere so much that it reduces my reproduction, that it reduces its own reproduction, then none of the genes have a chance to be passed on through me. This selects for a certain degree of what you could call intragenomic cooperation. And it means that often, even though it's not going to be perfectly accurate, we can think about individual reproduction as like a heuristic simplification. Because there's such a strong covariance between the reproductive interests of the genes within the organism that they have so much shared fate that you can think of most of the time what's going to allow an individual to have the most kids that survive to reproduce themselves. And that covariance doesn't even technically need to stop at the level of the organism. You could have covariance at higher levels of organization, like groups of people. I'm not going to talk much more about this, but multi-level selection is the framework that's been developed for thinking about how these hierarchical levels of covariance can create selection pressures at each of these levels of organization. The important thing that I want you to have is that multi-level selection is simply a way of thinking about gene frequency changes. It's mathematically equivalent to just thinking about gene frequency changes. And in the vast majority of cases, the higher up you go in levels of organization, the weaker and weaker and weaker selection gets. And so generally, the safest place and most productive place to work is going to be at the genetic level of analysis. That's going to be the safest and most useful level of analysis for working to make theories and predictions. All right. We probably have time for 1 or 2 questions if anyone has one.
Excuse me, I have 2 questions. So the first question is, you've talked about other psychological inquiries like neuroscience and cognitive neuropsychology. So because you said like the computational level is so important, so why do those inquiries do not consider this as the main focus of developing their theories, etc.?
That's, I think, you could think of it as a sociological question. So in many different places, thinking about natural selection and evolution is controversial. There's a lot of bad examples of, the eugenics movement and different cases where it became very socially unacceptable to think about. There's a lot of people in the United States, for example, who think that thinking about natural selection is against their religious beliefs. And so there's a lot of resistance to thinking about natural selection. And if you're not thinking about natural selection, it doesn't make sense, like you don't see the benefit. And if you have a resistance to seeing that benefit, then you see no reason to go there.
Sort of thinking like evolutionary psychology might lead to the social Darwinism. So they saw probably the problem of that, so they don't want to talk more about that. Is that the problem? The reason? Probably.
I think that's kind of the perception. So it's not true that thinking about evolution means that we need to have the political agenda of social Darwinism. We need to remember that understanding the way things are doesn't tell us the way things should be. There's a big difference between understanding what the world is and deciding how you want the world to be. Because you could understand that the world has, dangerous viruses, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't make medicine to help people not get sick, right? When we see things in the world that we don't like, we have no problem, exerting our moral values and making ethical decisions. There's nothing about understanding evolution that means that you should be a social Darwinist. Yeah, but I think you're right that that's what people are worried about.
All right. My second question is about the genes. Like in your description, I sort of thinking like it seems genes have their thoughts and they want to survive, so they have some strategies to increase their survival rate. Like when you talk about the genes of the flies, so if some, like some mutation helps them to increase their survival rate, the other genes might use some strategy to silence the function of that. So how was that achieved? And will this be covered in the course, the explanation of that?
So there's a problem here. And the problem is, one easy way to talk is to use mentalizing language. So like genes having strategies and wanting and interests and stuff like that. But obviously genes don't have strategies, don't have wants. It's just physics. Okay. And then when a mutation happens, that means that what came before is no longer spreading. So genes don't themselves benefit from mutating, because when they mutate, that old form no longer gets reproduced. And so the question is, when a new mutation happens, what will happen? Will it spread? And once one mutation spreads, if you think about a different mutation happening, will it spread? And by spreading, does it counteract the first mutation?
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right. That was today. See you next week.